So greetings everyone from whichever time zone you've joined in. I request as many of you to turn on your videos as you're comfortable. It's good to see faces. It's good to see smiling faces. It's good to see get inspired to smile by looking at each other's faces as well. Great. So today I'll be talking a little bit about Vedana. It's often translated as feeling. I also like the translation sensation for it. Right? So the idea of sensation. It is one of the 5 aggregates that make up experience. Right? So it is one of the 5 aggregates that the Buddha has described. You have feeling or sensation, which is Vedana. You have Roop, which is material form. You have Vigyan or Vinyana, which is consciousness. We have Sanya or Sangya, which is concepts. And we have Sankhara or Sanskar, which are formations. So these 5 come together like the ingredients of a dish to make up one moment of your experience. These are the 5 aggregates. Today we'll be looking at one aggregate, which is Vedana, feeling or sensation. And we'll also see how it connects with the other aggregates. What I'll do is I'll start with an excerpt from a sutta, and then I'd like to share some of my understanding about Vedana and how we can use this understanding to deepen our practice and actually integrate into our daily life. Okay, so the excerpt that I will be reading is from the Majjhima Nikaya, the middle length discourses of the Buddha, number 148, MN 148, the Chachak Sutra. By itself, this is a very, very powerful sutta. It really helps us to understand different parts of our experience as processes and not as things that are personal, that are mine, that is me, that is myself. A very powerful sutta, and this especially because of the amount of repetition that happens in this sutta. This is a great sutta for to be heard, right? And we've often found in retreats, somewhere just after the middle of the retreat, there is a reading of this sutta, and it leads to very, very deep experiences for me. So today I'll be taking a section of the sutta and using that to discuss more about Vedana, feeling or sensation. This section has a title called the underlying tendencies. So the Buddha says, Bhikkhus, dependent on the eye and visual forms, eye consciousness arises. The meeting of the 3 is contact. With contact as condition, there arises a feeling or sensation, felt as pleasant or painful, or neither painful nor pleasant. When one is touched by a pleasant feeling, if one delights in it, welcomes it, and remains holding to it, then the underlying tendency to lust lies within one. When one is touched by a painful feeling, if one sorrows, grieves, and laments, weeps, beating one's breast, and becomes distraught, then the underlying tendency to aversion lies within one. When one is touched by a neither painful nor pleasant feeling, if one does not understand as it actually is, the origination, the disappearance, the gratification, the danger, and the escape in regard to that feeling, then the underlying tendency to ignorance lies within one. Bhikkhus, that one shall here and now make an end of suffering without abandoning the underlying tendency to lust for pleasant feeling, without abolishing the underlying tendency to aversion towards painful feeling, without removing the underlying tendency to ignorance in regard to neither painful nor pleasant feeling, without abandoning ignorance and arousing true knowledge, this is impossible. Similarly, the Buddha expounds on the other sense bases. Bhikkhus, dependent on the ear and sounds, ear consciousness arises, and so on. Dependent on the mind and mind objects, mind consciousness arises. The meeting of the three is contact. With contact as condition, there arises a feeling, felt as pleasant or painful, or neither painful nor pleasant. Because that one should here and now make an end of suffering without abandoning the underlying tendency to lust for pleasant feeling, without abandoning ignorance and arousing true knowledge. This is impossible. The abandonment of the underlying tendencies. Bhikkhus, dependent on the I and forms, I consciousness arises. The meeting of the three is contact. With contact as condition, there arises a feeling felt as pleasant or painful, or neither painful nor pleasant. When one is touched by a pleasant feeling, if one does not delight in it, welcome it, and remain holding to it, then the underlying tendency to lust does not lie within one. When one is touched by a painful feeling, if one does not sorrow and grieve and lament, does not weep beating one's breast, and become distraught, then the underlying tendency to aversion does not lie within one. When one is touched by a neither painful nor pleasant feeling, if one understands as it actually is, the origination, the disappearance, the gratification, the danger, and the escape in regard to that feeling, then the underlying tendency to ignorance does not lie within one. Because that one shall here and now make an end of suffering by abandoning the underlying tendency to lust for pleasant feeling, by abolishing the underlying tendency to aversion towards painful feeling, by removing the underlying tendency to ignorance in regard to neither painful nor pleasant feeling, by abandoning ignorance and arousing true knowledge. This is possible. Because dependent on the ear and sounds, ear consciousness arises. Dependent on the mind and mind objects, mind consciousness arises. Meeting of the three is contact. With contact as condition, there arises a feeling, felt as pleasant or painful, or neither painful nor pleasant. Bhikkhus, that one shall here and now make an end of suffering by abandoning the underlying tendency to lust for pleasant feeling, by abolishing the underlying tendency to aversion towards painful feeling, by removing the underlying tendency to ignorance in regard to neither painful nor pleasant feeling, by abandoning ignorance and arousing true knowledge. This is possible. So we have quite a few long sentences, and it's quite remarkable how people in the oral tradition would have registered these sentences. It's easier for me to read them, and I'm sure it's a bit of a challenge for you to follow them fully while listening to them. So what we'll do is we'll look at what the Buddha has talked about here. We'll also look at, like I mentioned, how Vedana or sensation or feeling comes to be. So let's look at the first line that the Buddha talked about. It says, Dependent on the I and forms, I consciousness arises. The meeting of the three is contact. So let's start with contact. At any instant, contact is the beginning of your experience of a certain environment. So without contact, there will be no experience. Here the Buddha talks about one channel of senses, which is the eyes. In general, the Buddha talks about 6 different channels of experience. So anything that we experience originates at one of these bases. In a way, they can be thought of as our window to the world. So here the Buddha talks about eye and visual forms. So we have the eye and we have things that can be perceived by the eye. Light, which is in the visible spectrum for humans, right? So there can be light which is not in the visible spectrum for humans, and that may not be visible to us. So eye and forms, dependent on eye and forms, eye consciousness arises. The meeting of the three is contact. So you need 3 ingredients for contact. You have some information that is coming from the external environment. In the case of eye, it is light and forms. You have the sense base, which can actually receive this kind of information. So just like you have a mic on your phone or a camera on your phone, we have different bases or sensors for receiving information from our external and internal environment. All 3 of these things need to be active for there to be contact. So if your eye is not functioning or if your eye is closed and a form appears, you will not be able to see it. There will be no instance of contact. If your eye and eye consciousness are there, but you're sitting in absolute darkness, there is no visual form, there would not be any contact. And if your eye and form are there, but your eye consciousness or your ability to process visual information, due to some reason, it's not present at that moment, or you have some impairment with the ability to process information. If that happens, still contact will not happen. These 3 things need to come together. The information, a sensor which is able to receive that information, and the ability to process that information, which is consciousness. The meeting of the 3 is contact. So this is one sense channel. What are the 6 sense channels? We have the eyes, the first one. We have the ears, which respond to auditory information. We have the nose, which responds to olfactory information. We have the tongue, which responds to taste information. We have the body, which responds to tangible information. It can be external, it can be internal. You may have a pain internally and you can register it, for instance. And you have the mind as a sense channel, because there can be thoughts that arise and you can have the same thoughts or mind objects or ideas can arise. You have a sense space to receive that thought and you have an ability to process that mental information. So if the 3 of them meet as well, there is contact that is happening. With contact as condition, so only if contact happens, only if these 3 conditions are met, there arises a feeling felt as pleasant or painful, or neither painful nor pleasant. So I'm going to take a pause here and talk about why do we feel? What is the need for feeling? So we can understand we have to interact with the external environment. So yes, we should be able to receive some information and we should be able to have something within us that is able to receive that information. We should be able to process that information to make sense of it. So all of that makes sense. But why do we have feeling? Why do we have sensation? Why do we have Vedana, which is pleasant or painful or neither painful nor pleasant? So one thing to note here, Vedana is it's not, it's a pre-conceptual or non-conceptual sensation, right? So when we feel that sensation, there is a moment when we are feeling any sensation, we may have some idea around it, what is causing that sensation, whether it is heat, whether it is pain, whether it is something delicious, whether it is something foul smelling. Before we attach any labels or any concepts to that, there is a sensation which is either pleasant nor or unpleasant or neither painful nor pleasant. So what is the need for this feeling? All of you have practiced at least once, I believe. Sat down. I know many of you have regular practitioners, have spent a lot of time in meditation. And what we see is that our attention is moving from one thing to another till we reach a point of time where our attention gets collected. It doesn't chase after too many things and starts to get into the deep collected states, which are the jhanas. Until that point, we have our attention that is darting from one thing to another. So, in fact, estimates say that for a person engaged in normal activities, the attention moves from one thing to another at least 3 or 4 times every second. So, what is happening here? Why is attention moving? Why do we have feeling? So, have you ever had a toothache? Ever had pain in your tooth? Right. So, if you have, you can just raise your hand on the video, or you can just add something, right? Use a symbol on the chat or use a reaction. So toothache is very different from a scratch on the skin. Similarly, something going into our eye is very different from something that goes into our mouth. Right? So it feels very, very different. There are very different sensations that are associated. And this brings us to the idea of salience. So what's happening is, if you look at the 6 channels, right? So if you look at the eyes, the ears, the nose, the mouth, the body, and the mind. So we are continuously bombarded with information. So right now, I have the screen in front of me. I have visual information coming from everything around me. I have whatever furniture is there, the lights that are there. So I'm getting information. I have ambient sounds that are coming to my ears. I have the sensation of sitting in this chair, feet on the floor. I have different smells that are coming to me. I also have certain thoughts popping up in the background. Now, the problem is, in spite of having very, very magnificent mind, magnificent brain that is capable of very, very fantastic, very complex, very sophisticated thoughts, ideas, computations, reasoning. In spite of that, it takes a lot of energy to make sense of any particular information. So we have a construct of salience. Right? So salience helps us to understand what thing in all of this information, all the contact that is happening, do we need to pay our attention? And as we have discussed in previous talk, right? So broadly, the strongest underlying motivations as any mammal or any organism that is alive today is to be able to pass on its genes before it dies. Right? So that is the reason all organisms are alive. This means being able to reproduce, being able to conserve your energy so you don't eat too little and starve, or drink too little and die of thirst, and your ability to avoid harm. So if you encounter serious harm, it may end your life there and then. If you encounter mild harm, it may reduce your ability to conserve your energy, to get food, get water, whatever it is. Right? So we have these underlying motivations, and to satisfy these motivations, we have a concept of salience. So our system tries to see in our environment what is the thing that is most salient, what is the thing that is likely to be most advantageous to me, what is the thing that is likely to be most disadvantageous to you. And it wants our attention, our mental processing to go towards that because it is too expensive to computationally, for the mind, energetically, for the mind to spend time understanding and paying attention and thinking about and planning about every single thing that is in your environment at all points of time. So we want to prioritize. So it's a prioritization mechanism. So coming back to the example that is, why does a toothache or an eye feel very different from, or something going in the eye feel very different from something going in your mouth, or ache in your arm, or like a scratch on your. That's because if you look at it, teeth are one of the parts of the body that cannot be replaced. Your skin gets replaced all the time. If you get an injury, you have mechanisms within you to replace and repair and replenish that damage to the skin. And the eye is one of the most critical sense bases for us to navigate the world. So our system places a lot of importance or salience on the eye and the possibility of any harm. So if you have something in your eye going right now, you won't be able to look at anything else. Everything in the world can wait. I need to take care of it. If you have a toothache, everything in the world can wait. I have to take care of it. So there is an inbuilt prioritization that happens within us, which allows us to focus our attention on something and take the actions that are suitable. So this is required for survival. This is required for fulfilling the underlying hardwired motivations of energy conservation, harm avoidance, and reproduction. Right. So that's why we have feeling, because we can't pay attention to all things all the time and continue to think about them and plan about them and consider them, use all of our sophisticated mental abilities on. What we want to do is look at what is safe. And that's what Vedana or feeling allows us to do. But the problem is, this can often become misguided, right? So as soon as the feeling comes up, right, what happens is, the next step that happens in the process of dependent origination is, it forces you to take that thing personally. Right? So it is not, we in an uninstructed life or when we are not mindful, we do not see that this is a sensation. This is a signal that our mind, body, system thinks that something is important, something that is potentially advantageous, potentially disadvantageous. So instead of that, what happens is we collapse into that. We become one with that feeling. We identify with it. I like this. I want this. I will do anything to have this. I don't like this. I will do anything to get away. That becomes in the short term, that becomes the only motivation of our life, the only thing that is important. So if you have something stuck in your eye, that is very useful to get that away. But for example, if somebody honks a car, honks from a car behind, drives rashly, does something, that is another contact that happens that gives an unpleasant label, right? Initially, there might be some fear that maybe this is dangerous, or maybe you just don't like the sound. Over time, you have built that internal conditioning that you get very irritated when you hear that kind of sound. This is something we'll touch upon in just a minute. Somebody comes and honks, instead of seeing what is the action that is available to you, instead of seeing that this is a feeling that has brought our attention there. But maybe there is no action that we really need to take. We indulge in that. We get identified with that. We collapse into that. We become that feeling. We become that anger or irritation, that unpleasant feeling. And then all our next actions become dictated by that. I need to get back at this person. I need to chase after this person, or I need to honk at this person, or I need to emulate this person by driving rash. Right? So any of those things can happen. And why does this happen? So Vedana is not just our evolutionary thing that, a toothache, an eye ache, it is not restricted to that. Pleasant or unpleasant feeling is the way our entire efforts and energies start to get directed. So instead of, for an animal, if you look at it, nature cannot have help enable, for example, a wasp to say, okay, is this good for my harm avoidance? Is this good for my energy conservation? Is this good for my reproduction? Right? It cannot allow a simple being like a wasp to make those kind of computations. Nor do we do that. Nor do we use that lens. We may think about those things from time to time, but while taking every decision, we don't necessarily think about it in those terms, right? So instead, what our mind body system does is convert situations, convert different contacts into feelings of painful, pleasant, or neither painful nor pleasant. So, what is an example of neither painful nor pleasant? I'm sitting here, there are some books stacked behind my laptop. My mind says there is no great advantage or disadvantage to me in this moment. So, I have no feeling. Uh, that is no painful or pleasant feeling that is arising with regards to them. I have more of a neither painful nor pleasant feeling. So you can think of it as a continuum, and different things are placed there. So what are the things that affect the Vedana? So one thing is literally genetic hardwired uh, information, right? So tooth pain is one example. If you put, for example, a cucumber or a long gourd next to a cat, it will jump up in the air because evolutionarily it has hardwired that this could be something, it could be a predator like a snake, and it gives it immediately a painful feeling and it reacts to that. The other thing that might happen is conditioning. So conditioning can change the way feelings that you have about certain things. So if I show a picture of say a fried chicken or a steak, beef steak, right? So somebody who's been enjoying that kind of food all their life, they might salivate. They might have very pleasant feeling associated with that. Someone who is a vegetarian who is very opposed to eating meat. There are people from different, there are vegans, vegetarians. There are people who associate meat with climate change. They may have a very painful feeling when they see that same. Or there may be flavors that elicit that same kind of response. So this can come from conditioning, right? So you have, for example, a certain level of salt that you might like in a certain type of food. And if you find that the salt is too much or too little, you may get a painful feeling. If it is just right, you may get a pleasant feeling. If it is somewhere roundabout, you may get a neither painful nor pleasant feeling when you eat them. So conditioning, our experience can change the sensation that we associate with different things in the environment. And the final thing that can affect this is context. So the same thing that has a painful sensation in one context may have a pleasant feeling in another context, or neither painful nor pleasant feeling in yet another context. So let me use an example. Right? So for instance, if you see your the door of your house open, so that may have a neither painful nor pleasant feeling. But if you're out for vacation and you come back and you see the door of your house open, it may definitely immediately invoke a painful feeling. So if you are in a good mood, you've had a great day, and your child plays a prank on you, you may have a pleasant feeling. If you've not had such a good day and your child plays a prank on you, you may have an unpleasant feeling. So that is another thing that affects. So the context, what the context is right now, what is already coloring what's happening in your mind, that can change how the same thing generates different feelings in different circumstances. So we talked earlier about the aggregates, right? So far we have touched upon form, we have touched upon consciousness. The form is either the information that we're processing or the receptor, the sensor that we have within our system that receives that information. We have consciousness, which is the ability to process information. And we have Vedana or sensation, which helps us to understand the salience of that information, right? And the Vedana, like I talked about, right? So why different Vedana can arise, how it can vary between different people, how it can, the intensity of it can vary for you depending on the type of contact, and how the feeling or sensation can vary depending on context, right? So that is that the way that operates is essentially stored in your formations, right? So on your sankhara or sanskara. So your tendency to like a certain dish or not like a certain dish, like a type of joke, not like a type of joke, like a type of ideology or not like a type of ideology. All that is kind of stored in your configuration. And this is constantly in flux depending on the context, depending from moment to moment. This is realigning to cause you to behave in a certain way, right? So this is what Vedana does. And once that painful feeling or that pleasant feeling or that neither painful nor pleasant, if we do not see it simply as a feeling, simply as a something that our existing configuration, are the impressions and experiences that we have gathered over life and through our biology, right? So it is a signal coming from that something may be harmful or beneficial. If we stop at that point and then see what is the most appropriate response, appropriate action that we can take in that situation that causes minimum suffering for ourselves, minimum suffering for other people, then we are able to have a completely different attitude towards it. However, if we collapse into that feeling, if we become that feeling, we become completely, and this is how craving works. The tightness that we talk about that develops in our mind, we become wrapped up in that feeling. That nothing is more important in the world than going towards this pleasant feeling or going away from that unpleasant feeling. And the same tendency of being identified that gets strengthened even if it is a neither painful nor pleasant feeling. Maybe you don't react, maybe you don't take an action, but the way you perceive that situation, the way you engage with that situation is colored by that sense of self and that identification. So this is what the Buddha talks about when he talks about the underlying tendency to lust, underlying tendency to aversion, and underlying tendency to ignorance in this case. That in either case, our immediate next step is to get collapse into that and identify with that. That I have a certain reality. Or we start looking at reality in a certain way, which is where the fifth aggregate of Sangya or concepts come. So the concepts that we apply to that situation in that moment become colored by that feeling. So if you look at two spouses, husband and wife, or any other two spouses, right? So at one time when they're getting along, the other person is the most important person. Most in the world, nothing is more important. I worship this person. Caught up in the pleasant feeling. When there is an argument, they want to harm the other person or win that argument at any cost. Identified with that unpleasant feeling. So your concepts that you attach, the meaning that you attach, gets heavily colored by the feeling or vedana that you're collapsing. I'm sorry, there is something getting cooked. Just choking on the fumes of that. So this is how the five aggregates come together. And if we identify with the feeling, if we don't understand this simply as a signal and do not see ourselves being compelled by the flavor of that Vedana to act in a certain way, right? So with the same people, the parent and the child, happy one time when the child plays a prank, annoyed one time when the child plays a prank. So that Vedana is very contextual, and If we react considering that as the basis of reality, we will end up creating suffering, while we also end up strengthening our identification with certain situations, taking it personal, becoming completely identified with it. We also strengthen our tendency to get attached with that feeling with craving, right? With the basis of craving, taking things personally. And every time we take an action, we are further coloring our formations or sanskaras. So, for instance, if every time I listen to a horn, I get irritated and annoyed, and I stay with that feeling, I have craving, engaged with that feeling, I've identified with that, I'm irritated for the next 15 minutes. Then my mind knows, my mind body system knows that this is how we react to this situation. It knows that Rajiv really cares about things being honked. He spent 15 minutes thinking about it. So next time somebody honks, it will come with even more intensity. Hey, we spent 15 minutes thinking about this. So this is salient. This is important. Rajiv has put his stamp on this, that this is an important thing. Let's pay attention. Instead, if I was to let go of the craving, our mind learns that this is not so important. I don't need to get personally identified with this situation. I don't need to spend 15 minutes thinking about it. Over time, this changes the Vedana that arises in identical situations. Next time somebody honks, the Vedana becomes a little less unpleasant. Next time somebody honks, the Vedana becomes a little less unpleasant. Like I said, Vedana is also colored by our condition. It is colored by the experiences that we have had. That includes the actions, mental, physical, or verbal, that we have taken while having those experiences. So, what does this tell us? Let's go back to what the Buddha talked about. And the Buddha says, what is the right way to look at Vedana, look at feeling? When one is touched by a pleasant feeling, if one does not delight in it, welcome in it, and remain holding to it, then the underlying tendency to lust does not lie within one. When one is touched by a painful feeling, if one does not sorrow, grieve, and lament, does not weep beating one's breast, and become distraught, then the underlying tendency to aversion does not lie within one. When one is touched by neither painful nor pleasant feeling, if one understands as it actually is, the origination, the disappearance, the gratification, the danger, and the escape in regard to that feeling, then the underlying tendency to ignorance does not lie within. That is how we need to deal with feelings. I'll just add one more thing before opening up for Q&A. The origination, the disappearance, the gratification, the danger, and the escape. This is an understanding of the fact that feelings arise due to conditions being conducive for that contact happening, and the feeling being driven by our past experience and the current context. The disappearance, that the feeling disappears when the contact disappears. The feeling can change as our formations change. The gratification, taking things personally, getting identified with that feeling. The danger, once we are identified with that feeling, we have no choice but to go after what is pleasant and go away from what is unpleasant, to the cost of everything else, to the cost of doing unwholesome actions, and to the cost of reinforcing that tendency to personalize that situation and allow craving to grow within us. That is the danger and the escape. The escape is to let go of craving. In this practice, clear way, recognize that our attention is engaged with this feeling, with craving underlying it. Release that thought. Understand that we do not need to continue to be engaged with that thought or that feeling. Relax the tension and tightness, which is correlated with the craving that binds us and personalizes us in that situation. Smile, start moving towards an uplifted state of mind that is not caught up in craving. and return or reset our mind to a wholesome state from where we can take actions that are beneficial for us and for other people. And to repeat this as many times as required. That one shall here and now make an end of suffering by abandoning the underlying tendency to lust for pleasant feeling, by abolishing the underlying tendency to aversion towards painful feeling, by removing the underlying tendency to ignorance in regard to neither painful nor pleasant feeling, by abandoning ignorance and arousing true knowledge. This is possible. So I'll pause with that. Happy to hear any thoughts, any questions, any experiences that you may have remembered during this discussion.
Without speaking, perception and consciousness, because they are conjoined, you completed your speech. Because contact is there in the beginning. Without contact, all the three will not come.
Absolutely.
And past is coming without perception. Or whatever the present is happening, or anything it is coming to the thought. Without perception, it cannot come. Memory.
Right.
This is what. But everything covered in a nice manner, but at the same time, perception is not mentioned at all. I conjoined the three factors.
Yes.
That's
So
what.
perception is the concepts that we are talking about, right? Sankhya. That is. They are conjoined with feeling, conjoined with consciousness. Absolutely. Any other comments or thoughts or questions?
Hello, sir.
Yes.
Sir, sir, I would like to just share the changes which has happened because of film. Like whatever
Absolutely,
the
that'll be
perception
lovely.
earlier which we used to do. Sir, could you able to hear, sir?
Yes, I can.
Hello, sir. Yes, sir. So because of film practice, our way of looking things have been changed. And we can know exactly how our thoughts are getting processed because of practice. It is really helpful in our day-to-day activities, sir. And
That is
being mindful. And
Do
thank
you
you to
find
all
any changes?
film students.
Do you find any changes in the kind of Vedana that arises in different situations?
Yes, I feel sometimes I feel changes in the sensation which we experience sometimes,
Right.
but we can know easily identify it exactly. We can easily identify and we can know what to do about it exactly.
No, that is
It's good, sir.
wonderful
Thank
to
you to
hear.
all film teachers, sir, and all supporters, sir, who's making a path to happiness. Thank you, sir.
Great. Any other thoughts, comments, questions, experiences to share?
Whatever is happening by way of feeling or anything, because of the conditions, the cause and effect or anything, it is out of sheer ignorance. Without that, nothing will come. That ignorance goes only at the last stage. Till such time, all these concepts, everything will be continuing with us.
Right. Feelings will arise, and that is why the Buddha also emphasizes on craving as the root of suffering. So feeling happening is a automatic immediate step after contact. So we need, feeling is important for us to be able to make sense of the environment and to respond to the environment. So feeling is not dispensable. What is dispensable is craving. What do we do when the feeling comes up? Do we become a slave to that liking or disliking? Do we get identified with that liking or disliking of that situation? So that is the thing that is important, and that is the actionable part of dependent origination.
Agree. After the feeling, you get some sort of shankara. That shankara, because we'll identify, but after certain age, some sort of shiver will be there. Is it really connected to the correct way of feeling? No. It is only because of body is becoming old. Some shiver comes. Even when we are doing jhana also, some
So
sort of.
can you elaborate a little bit? What kind?
Yes, yes,
You're
agree.
saying after the feeling there is some shivering.
Some body shivers.
Hmm.
Because it is a vibrating energy before going that advanced level or anything. Body shivers.
There could be many reasons for
Like
it.
that,
Age, like you mentioned, could be a reason.
in the jhana, like this, it goes like this. Some people, it is not intentionally is not doing.
There can be some movements, but in general, it is likely that if there is a lot of movement, it is happening because of too much energy or intensity being put into it. And that will come in the way of becoming more collected and perceptive. It can help in becoming more one-pointed, but it may come in the way of becoming more collected and perceptive, right? So the more you're moving around, right? So what happens is, like we talked about salience. So as long as all your channels are active, when you're moving around, there is some contact of air with your body, which is changing. There is contact with your entire center of gravity is changing, right? The sounds that you're hearing, they're hearing from a different axis at all points of time. So whenever there is change, the natural tendency to give some salience to those things will come up. And as a result of that, when we move too much, right, it gets difficult to go into the deeper states. And what happens sometimes, people overcompensate by becoming more one-pointed. So what happens is they become attached with the object of meditation to the exclusion of other things that are. And when we go in that direction, then our ability to be perceptive of the different things that are happening goes down, because our field of awareness becomes very narrow. Yes, so that's what I had. So as long as it is, I mean, sometimes there may be a physical, there may be weakening of musculature that makes it difficult to sit in a certain position. But to the extent possible, if you're aware of it, let out of the enlightenment factors or awakening factors, right? One should look more towards tranquility, relaxing the mind and body, relaxing the mental and bodily formations to allow the body to get into a state that is collected and mind and body to get into a state that is collected and immobile. Okay, I think we can stop at that point and share merits. May suffering ones be suffering free, and the fear struck fearlessly. May the grieving shed all grief, and may all beings find relief. May all beings share this merit that we have thus acquired for the acquisition of all kinds of happiness. May beings inhabiting space and earth, devas and nagas of mighty power, share in this merit of ours. May they long protect the Buddha's dispensation. Sa, sa, sa. Thank you, everyone. Have a lovely week.
Thank you.